Good morning, everyone. I'm Sang Hyuk-lee, Senior Fellow at the East-West Center and the Professor and Chair of Economics at the University of Hawaii. So we'll begin with a special welcome chant Hawaiian only. So Ms. Vicky Holt Takamine is one of the prominent master teachers in the art of hula. So she and her team will present Hawaiian only. So Hawaiian culture continues to thrive through oral traditions.
Elina manoa ka lehua aloha, aloha ua tuahine. Mai lua hine a iwaikiki, kia ike ka haukani. Hani no na leo, e o ka ma'aina, aina aloha.
Next, Richard Buistek, President of East-West Center, will give welcoming remarks. Actually, he said, I will do live, and then I said, of course. So it will be live.
Good morning, all. Greetings and aloha from Honolulu. It's just after 5 o'clock here in the morning, which is my usual wake-up time to do morning exercise. So I'm especially pleased to match the physical exercise with intellectual exercise as well. As some have mentioned, I am Richard Volstein, President of the East-West Center, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome you to the 13th International Conference on the Generational Economy. We're honored to host this conference at the East-West Center, but it's also appropriate that we do so in that we have a long history of working on issues related to population change and its socio-economic impact. In 1970, when I came to the East-West Center, was just about the time the Population Institute was founded back in 1970, in the fall, and we've been working on population issues ever since then. At the East-West Center, involving people throughout the Asia-Pacific region. Today, we are in a very special inflection point, I think, even for conferences at the East-West Center, let alone the way we operate. As the whole world is adjusting to virtual activities because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it also turns out to have somewhat of a silver lining in the fact that we now find that the conferences and activities we run at the East-West Center involve more people simultaneously, and not just from Asia Pacific, but globally. And this conference is a good example of that. Instead of spending hours and hours on the plane trying to get to the East-West Center for a conference, now it's common every day for us to have people from Africa, from Europe, South America, across the United States to be involved in some sort of meeting at the East-West Center week on week, month on month. We also know that given the trends of the current pandemic, that this is going to be the new normal for us, but a new normal that gives us a great opportunity to engage more people simultaneously globally and not just in the Asia Pacific region. So we are delighted that this first attempt at on this conference internationally is laid out so well. I commend you all for whether it's early morning, late afternoon, or wherever to be part of these activities over the next several days. We know that all countries around the world are facing important structural shifts that will potentially slow down economic growth, perhaps radically. One factor in recovery as well as sustainability is, of course, is their population profile, including population aging as a part of the shift away economies have to adjust. Population change, as you all know, can lead to very different outcomes. And you've all worked on issues of both young and aging population dynamics and have generated useful analytic and predictive models useful for government decision makers based on your excellent data. But now with our ongoing global pandemic, there's a real threat to the models I think people have used throughout governments and decision-making organisms and institutions. It's an excellent time to rethink the cost of health and its impact on populations, and not only on working populations, but those who must take care of those who are ill, and the disruption predictability on consistency of working populations because of an ongoing pandemic. These are worrisome times. I hope that your discussions over the next few days will bring about results useful for leaders at all levels of society and government. We all prefer predictability, but we are now in a highly unpredictable environment in which we find ourselves encountering all sorts of substantial challenges to us all: political, health, and the future of work and how it takes place. I sincerely hope that your deliberations will generate thoughtful, useful, and relevant guidelines for near and midterm decision makers who are already worried about the sustainability of their economies, the strength of their workforce, the ability to successfully embrace the radically new normal way of life. So in this new normal conference, bringing people together globally, I would like to specifically thank the organizing committee, especially Andy Mason and Sung-Hyuk Lee, as well as our East-West Center staff members, Mary Chang and Justina Leach, for organizing this conference. My thanks in advance as well to all moderators, presenters, and discussants for taking time from your busy schedules to join us for this important event over the next several days. Finally, I extend all best wishes and aloha to your families, your communities, for safety and health in these very difficult times. Mahalo.
Okay, thank you very much. Everyone is muted, so I'll just give you a big applause. Okay, thank you. Okay, so Andy asked me to introduce the generational economy. I think probably this is the most boring speech. Actually, I prepared a few slides, so let me actually begin with this. This is actually Wheel of Fortune. So let me actually run this field. Oh, that's 900 actually. There is no bankruptcy, there is no loser turn, something like that. So I think many of you have seen this one before, but let me actually do it again. So how about N? There are 4 N's. I can buy a bar, A. Yeah, there are 4 A's. So that's, I can actually solve this puzzle. That's national transfer accounts. Yeah, I mean, so that's actually NTA. So what is NTA? What is National Transfer Accounts or generational economy? So the goal is to improve our understanding of the generational economy, and it describes the age patterns of economic activity and the economic relations between the generations, and quantifies how each age group acquires and uses economic resources. So I think, we actually have constructed using existing data and crunched the data, population estimates surveys, and administrative records, macroeconomic data. And it's consistent with the UN system of national accounts. So what's the outcomes from NTA? The first is data improvement. You may know that Korea actually is the first country who made the NTA data government official statistics. And a lot of research and the policy awareness, like Thailand. Thailand made NTA, use NTA for their national planning and capacity building. We have had so many meetings, regional meetings. So there are manuals, hundreds of articles, and policy bulletins. So I think most of you, not everyone probably, but there are 2 founders, Ron Lee and Andy Mason, and they started this NTA. in year 2004. And we have had many, good moments. So they had many offspring. So I would say the total fertility rate is over 100 from them. So this is a global meeting. So our first meeting actually was held in Berkeley, January 2004. And this is the 13th. Actually, I don't know whether this is actually 13th or 1st. So the location is virtual Honolulu or cyberspace, Cyber Honolulu, August 2020. So this is our group picture. I mean, this year it is quite different from the past. So but that's okay. That's okay. That's the difference. So what's the conclusion? I mean, our group picture is different, but don't let COVID-19 stress take over our life and our research. That's my actually welcoming remarks. That's my message. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. So let's see. Also, next, let me actually introduce Courtney Coyle, and she'll present. Courtney Coyle is professor of economics at Wellesley College. She is a research associate at National Bureau of Economic Research, where she serves as co-director of the NBER, Retirement and Disability Research Center. She also serves as co-director of the NBER, Retirement and Disability Research Center. She also serves as a co-director of an international social security project, which is called the ISS, which is a collaborative research project involving teams in a dozen countries. And Professor Coyle is a member of the Committee on Population at the National Academy of Sciences and a member of the Data Monitoring Committee of the Health and Retirement Study. Her research focuses on the economics of aging and health, with particular interest and emphasis in retirement decisions, health trends, and public programs used by older and disabled populations. She is the author of dozens of articles and book chapters. Especially her two books are very famous, right? She is a co-author of the Reconsidering Retirement, and the co-editor of the famous series of social security programs and retirement around the world. Dr. Coyle received her PhD in economics from MIT and bachelor degree from Harvard University. Please welcome Dr. Courtney Coyle.
Thank you so much for that introduction and also for the invitation to be with you all. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Please do let me know right away if there's any technical issues here. So the topic I wanted to take up in this talk is whether living longer is translating into working longer around the world. And let me just begin with some facts on living longer, which of course are going to be well known in this group. So I started with life expectancy at age 50 because I think that's sort of a useful age for thinking about work at older ages and retirement. And this is for women going back to 1950. And so we can see that a woman who reached age 50 in 1950 could expect to live about 2 additional decades. And in the 70 years since, that's grown by 9 years or almost another decade to have a life expectancy of about 3 decades. So that's for the global average. And what's evident from the rest of the graph is splitting this up by the income groups of the countries. And I should say this is the World Bank's classification based on current levels of GNI per capita. So there is, it's very interesting actually to note that there's some inequality in those gains over the past 70 years, with the biggest increases among the high income and upper middle income countries. I won't actually have a lot to say about that inequality. I think it's a really important topic that would be worth another talk all on its own. But the point I really wanted to make is that there's increase in all of the countries, even if it's a bit unequal. All of the countries have seen large increases in female life expectancy over the last 70 years. And even if we focus on the last 30 years, we see increases of sort of 3 to 5 years. Here's the trends for men, and basically they're very, very similar. The levels are slightly lower, as is well known, but once again, we see an increase in life expectancy over these 70 years of about 9 years, or over the more recent 30 years of about 3 or 4 years. And that's, again, somewhat unequal, but we see gains in all of the countries. So here's some graphs on labor force participation, and just a couple things to note that are different from the graphs I was showing before. First of all, I don't have the data for 1950, so we just have the 2 time periods. And whereas before I put the box around the world figure, here I'm going to put the box around those countries, those country groups that had the largest increases, just so that we can see that the most easily. And I'm going to look at this separately by age group as well as by gender. So I have a lot of graphs like this, but I'll just flip through them pretty quickly. So female labor force participation at ages 50 to 54 over the past 30 years, we can see a large increase in high income countries. That's about a 17 percentage point increase, and a smaller, but an increase in the next group, the upper middle income group. By contrast, we don't see any increase. We see a slight decrease actually in the lower middle income and the lower income country groups. Similar pattern with even bigger magnitudes here for the age 55 to 59 women. Now we've got double-digit increases in both of these higher income country groups, similar at ages 60 to 64. And at the oldest age group, 65 plus, the increases don't look that big, but they're off of a relatively low base. So I think this is still pretty significant. If we look for men, we don't see any changes, if anything, sort of a slight decrease in that sort of older, you might think of this as like a prime age group, 50 to 54. But at ages 55 to 59, we start to see that increase. And here it's limited just to the high income countries, not extending to that next group of upper middle. This is the really biggest gap, or sorry, I shouldn't say gap, but growth of about 15 percentage points over these 30 years for these men 60 to 64. And then again, a sort of smaller in percentage points, but looks, you know, fairly big relative to a low base at ages 65 plus. So very quickly, the facts are that we are living longer all around the world. We see increases in countries of all income levels, some inequality in those gains, which, as I said, I'm not going to have a lot more to say about that, but we see increases across all the country groups. But we're really only working longer in the richer countries. And the effects are biggest for women in high income countries, but we see double-digit increases for women in upper middle income countries in a couple of the age groups. And we see the biggest increase for men coming in these high income countries at ages 60 to 64 specifically. So the questions I want to take up in the rest of the talk are, first of all, what does economic theory tell us about whether we expect people to work longer as life expectancy is increasing? Number two, what do we know about why people seem to be working longer in richer countries? And can we draw any inferences about whether we might expect to then see this trend spread to other groups of countries? And I'll just close with really more questions than conclusions about just what are the implications of the fact that in parts of the world people are living longer but not working longer. So before I get into economic theory, I just wanted to put this up as sort of a little diagram to kind of fix ideas. What are we talking about here when we're talking about people living longer and the potential effects on work? So these numbers are sort of for a male global average. So that person in 1990 could expect to, if they survived to age 50, they could expect to live about another 24 years to age 74. And if we look at when labor force participation across the globe kind of drops below 50%, it might be sort of reasonable to think that this person is planning to work to about age 66, work another 16 years, and then have 8 years in retirement. So the question is, what would we expect, or what are the range of possibilities for a similar person who reaches age 50 in 2020, now with a life expectancy of 78, 4 additional years? What are they going to do with those 4 years? Well, one possibility is that they keep their retirement age the same at 66, and then they would have 4 extra years of retirement. Another possibility is that they continue to plan for an 8-year length of retirement and work the whole 4 additional years. And an option that falls sort of somewhere in the middle of those would be that the person might think about keeping the share of work life, the share of their adult life that they spend working versus retired constant, keep that as a constant fraction, and that might look something like working 3 additional years and having 1 additional year of retirement. And this is just to sort of illustrate some of the range of possibilities that, that might occur. And you can see with numbers 2 and 3, we would expect to see an increase in labor force participation, in this case in the late 60s, associated with people working longer. So what does economic theory tell us about, if anything, about which of these options we would expect? And actually, there's no clear consensus from theory. The range of possible outcomes are even broader than what I showed in that diagram. So first of all, people pointed out that there's something that we might think of as a horizon effect. If you're going to live additional years, you need more resources to finance those extra years of if we think about a forward-looking consumer who's maximizing their utility, they don't want to have no consumption or very low consumption in old age. So that changes the incentives for work and savings at younger ages. And at least under certain assumptions, that would the prediction would be that they would retire later as a result. Other authors have pointed out that as we're living longer, there may also be a decrease in the variability of the age of death. In other words, that when it's highly uncertain whether you're going to live to older ages, it may not necessarily make sense to plan for retirement and save. But as we're living longer, if there's also a decrease in that variability, suddenly it may become optimal to save and plan for retirement. In that case, we might see even earlier retirement. That's a range of possibilities that wasn't even on my little diagram before. A third effect that some authors have pointed to is that we need to not only think about the length of life, but whether we're healthier as we age. And there's some evidence, at least in the United States and some other countries, for a compression of morbidity or disability, that we have a shorter period of time at the end of life that we are unhealthy as we are living longer. So these authors say that you might think of that in a way as being like an income effect, that the possibility that the budget constraint has expanded because we have this better health at older ages. And that income effect, when you combine it with the horizon effect that makes us want to work later, we're going to want to work later, but there's going to be a less than proportional increase in the working life because of this income effect piece associated with living healthier. And finally, I think it's been understood for a long time that longer life expectancy also affects the returns to education. So if we make education endogenous in the model and have the individuals choosing their level of schooling as well as their retirement, then they may choose an earlier level of education, have higher wages, and then that higher wages can push to earlier retirement. So you can see that there's a lot of different possibilities, and I think there's room for even more work in this area. The literature on savings has incorporated the role of social insurance programs and health shocks and precautionary savings. And so thinking about how that intersects with the increase in life expectancy, I think is an interesting area for future work. So I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about why people are retiring later in the higher income countries. But before I do that, I actually need to take a step back and point out that this recent trend towards working later actually reverses a century-long trend towards earlier retirement. So this is a graph from the work of the economic historian Dora Costa, which I'm very fond of this graph, and she's put together data on labor force participation rates at ages 65 and up for the United States and 3 countries in Europe, going back to, in the case of the US, 1850. And what we can see is at the beginning of the graph, these are very high participation rates at older ages, obviously in a period of time when life expectancy at older ages would have been even a lot less than it is now. So most people worked at older ages. And what you see over the course of the graph is really retirement becoming what we think of now as like this third phase of life, right? That people are a child and they get their human capital accumulation, then they're a prime age adult, they work, they have families, and then that they have this retirement phase that comes after. But that really is something that emerged over the course of the 20th century. So this is kind of putting the 2 pieces together and showing you where this trend came to an end. These are the 12 countries that are part of the International Social Security Project. I'll just have a little bit more to say about that project in a minute, but it's basically the countries represented on the graph are Japan, Canada, the US, and 9 European countries. So it's sort of like a representative selection of these sort of upper income country group. And I think what's really interesting about this graph, you see the decline in labor force participation that was on Dora Costa's graph, through the 80s up to the mid 90s, and then labor force participation starts to increase. And the level of participation is obviously different across these countries, but the trends are very similar. In particular, this U-shaped sort of turnaround appears to happen about the same time in all of these countries. I should say this is men age 60 to 64 here. And while the magnitude of the increase does differ, in some countries it's 10 to 15 percentage points, in other countries it's 30 to 35 percentage points, but the trends are very similar in terms of the timing and the U-shape. This is the equivalent graph for women. And you don't see the down part of the U as clearly because in many of these countries, sort of women's rates of labor force participation were lower to begin with and just kind of more stable. But you definitely see the increase, and it's just as large, if not larger, for women. So what might help to explain these trends in labor force participation that we see in higher income countries? Well, the literature has sort of talked separately about this period of earlier retirement that was sort of most of the 20th century, and then the later period. So I'm going to stick with that and describe it that way as well. So in terms of explanations for earlier retirement, people have pointed to rising real income or rising wages. And for that story to hold, because obviously rising wages have both income and substitution effects. So it needs to be a story where the income effects are stronger than the substitution effects, and particularly a story where it might make sense to take that extra leisure kind of in a chunk at the end of life, as opposed to sort of spread out over the course of life. There's also stories that have to do with changes in production technology. And here people tend to talk about how when the economy was more agrarian or production was based on paying people piece rate, if the productivity of workers tends to decline as they age, they can still be accommodated within those types of economies and remain at work. Whereas in a more modern economy, it may not be possible, but as people's productivity declines with age, they may not be able to continue to work because it becomes more of an all or nothing thing, as opposed to something where you can kind of gradually work less. So that's another story. And a third story that I find persuasive is about the growth of public pensions. So obviously the 20th century is a period of time when a lot of those countries, upper income countries, adopted public pensions. Pensions spread to cover a larger fraction of the workforce, and they also became bigger just in real terms. And there's some really nice quasi-experimental evidence cited here. All of these studies have to do with the United States, and they all are a little different. So Dora Costa's paper is about actually the pensions paid to veterans of the US Civil War. Dan Fetter and Lee Lockwood have a nice paper that's about the US Old Age Assistance Program, which was a state-based program that predated Social Security. And Alex Gelber and some co-authors have a paper about a sudden change in Social Security benefits called the Social Security Notch. So these are all like quasi-experimental kind of papers. And if you extrapolate their estimates to the growth of Social Security over the 20th century, they would argue that a significant share of that decline in participation that we saw in Dora Costa's graph can be explained by the growth of pensions. The most common explanations cited for the more recent trend of the last 30 years, later retirement, are as follows. So one is rising education. Now this might sound a little confusing given some things I already said about education on an earlier slide, but the people point out that in the cross section, we certainly see that people with higher education retire later, right, than people with lower education. And this may also have to do with be a bit of a story about the changing nature of work. As work is less physical and more intellectual, it may be possible for people to work longer. There's also a story that improving health is making it possible for people to work longer, to the extent that health was a limiting factor, that constraint may be relaxed. The story about cohort effects for women, I think, is an important piece of it. So Claudia Golden and Larry Katz have a nice book from a couple of years ago on women working longer in the United States that basically argues that the cohorts of women that we see working more now are the same cohorts who got more education and also maintained a more consistent commitment to the labor force, like through having children, et cetera. So, you know, that might be part of the reason why we see even bigger effects for women at older ages, is that we have these cohort effects going on. And there's this nice argument by Tammy Sherrill in a paper that this can also affect their husbands through a complementarity of leisure kind of story. So she basically uses trends in women's participation at midlife to kind of instrument for their participation at older ages, and then use that to tease out the effect of wives' participation on husbands. And she ends up claiming that about a third or a quarter of the increase in participation in a few countries like the US, Canada, and the UK can be accounted for by these cohort effects of women working more and that keeping their husbands in the labor force more. And then there's a story about pension reforms that I'll come and talk to you about in more detail. So I want to present some evidence on a couple of these theories, but mostly the pension one, coming from the NBR International Social Security Project. And just a really quick headlines about what this project is, in case you're not familiar with it. It was started in the mid-1990s by David Wise of the Harvard Kennedy School. It includes those 12 countries that I mentioned, US, Canada, Japan, and 9 European countries. And the goal all along, similar I think maybe to aspirations of this group in some way, is to have all of our countries do things in a very similar way so that we can put things together for cross-country comparisons that are usually somewhat difficult in a research context where everybody's just doing their own kind of study on their own country. So this is just a quick look at how plausible is it that health and education are important trends in health and education are important drivers of labor force trends. And I guess the thing I really wanted to point out here is that at least in terms of looking for a factor that can be sort of a unifying theory explaining both the decline and then the increase, in other words, explaining the U-shape, health and education don't seem to provide you with that, because health, at least measured here as mortality risk, has just improved continuously over this period, right? And similarly with education, especially if you look at the education of men, that factor was also rising long before participation started rising. We also do something very simple in our group of 12 countries, which is just look to see if those countries that have had the biggest change in mortality risk or the biggest change in education have had the biggest change in work. And we find no evidence that that's the case. This is where I'm starting to make the case about pensions. This is a very big, busy chart. So let me just draw your attention to the headline right at the top, which is what I want you to take away from it. So this is a list of pension reforms across our 12 countries, basically since 1980. So, and where the years are filled in the chart, it's where countries have had a reform of that specific type. And so the bottom line is that pension reforms have been very frequent during this period, especially since the mid-1990s, and they've generally worked in the direction to strengthen work incentives. And the way you can see that part about strengthening work incentives is to focus on the things I've highlighted in orange. So those are changes like raising the eligibility age for the public pension, or raising the minimum number of years that you would have to have in order to claim early before the normal eligibility age. Also changes like just reducing the generosity of the benefit, strengthening the actuarial adjustment. So that's the rate at which the benefit is increased if you wait 1 year to take it up. And then if you look down at the bottom where it says other pathways, in many of these countries, it was quite common for a lot of workers to exit the labor force prior to reaching the age of eligibility for the standard public pension and go on to disability insurance or unemployment insurance or some kind of other special early retirement program. And in the case of DI and UI, these often had special rules for older workers that, for instance, exempted them from job search or exempted them from needing to be disabled, et cetera. And so if you look at that black box along the right edge of the chart, that just shows you the number of countries that have done this type of reform over this period since 1980. And what you can see is that very many of the countries in our studies have done things like raising the eligibility ages, reducing generosity, and shutting down to some extent these other pathways like DI and UI. Okay. So this is just a picture just showing you some of this increase in Social Security eligibility ages. So the individual countries are not so important. It's just you can see the overall trends, or these ages are going up. And then it's pretty easy to do case studies like this, where you can make the case that these eligibility ages changes have led to labor force participation increases at older ages. So this graph is from the UK, and each of these squiggly lines represents the labor force participation for women at a specific age, like 59, 60, 61. And what these solid black lines are showing is how every time the state pension age went up by 1 year, like from 60 to 61, you get pretty much an immediate 10 percentage point increase in the labor force participation at that specific age, right? While it remains pretty constant at the other surrounding ages. So it's really hard to come up with a story for this kind of behavior that's anything other than the pension reform driving these increases in work at older ages. And you could do a similar analysis for like Italy or Japan and make the same kind of case. Of course, a lot of the pension reforms that I talked about, like changing the actuarial adjustment or the benefit generosity, that's separate, that's distinct from the eligibility age. So what we wanted to do in our project was to have another kind of summary measure that could encapsulate how these changes in pension reforms were affecting the incentive to work at older ages. So what we've done is calculate, for example, suppose a worker is age 60, they retire today and they get a stream of pension benefits over their life. Now we're going to recompute if that same worker waits a year and retires at 61, what's the stream of benefits that would come by doing that instead. And there different factors are going to come into play, right? The actuarial adjustment, how much higher is the benefit if you wait a year? Does it get recomputed, the benefit, because you now have an extra year of earnings in the formula? You pay a year of payroll taxes, you give up a year of benefits at age 60. So typically the net of all these things is negative once you get to the eligibility age for pensions. In other words, your stream of benefits is going to be smaller if you wait. But what's happened so we call that that decrease in pension wealth scaled by earnings, we call that the implicit tax. And so this graph is showing the average implicit tax, just unweighted average across our 12 countries over time. And this is isolating the changes in the implicit tax that are just coming from those pension reforms. We've held constant wages, life expectancy, just to understand how are pension reforms changing incentives. And what you can see is that at the beginning of the period, the Social Security system at older ages was serving as like an implicit tax rate of like 60%, and that's come down by about half. And whereas even at younger ages, there was an implicit tax, now that system is sort of relatively neutral with respect. It's neither a tax nor a subsidy at younger ages. And here's the graph for women. You know, these things are a little noisy, but it's a very similar downwards trend. And finally, I just wanted to point out that if we're searching for a universal theory that can explain the U shape in labor force participation, we might want to look at the implicit tax rate because it has that inverse U shape where from the period from 1980 to 1995, implicit tax rates were rising. And then from the period of 1995 to present, implicit tax rates have been falling. And the ongoing work of our group is attempting to use these pension reforms to, more really nail down this relationship between Social Security incentives and these changes in work over the last 35 years. So turning to other types of countries, so I've argued that some of the big contributors to the recent increases in labor force participation at older ages in high and upper middle income countries are likely these cohort changes in women's labor force participation and pension reforms. And so might we expect then to see a trend towards longer work lives in other types of countries if we think about these same factors? So I would argue that it doesn't look like there's a surge in female labor force participation happening in the lower middle and low income countries. So this is younger ages now, 25 to 54, again over the same 30-year time period, and things have been pretty stable over this time period. In terms of whether pension reforms are happening or likely to happen in these countries, this is the Melbourne Mercer Global Pension Index. So this is their ratings of basically how their ratings are based on pension adequacy, sustainability, and integrity. So it's not only about how sustainable the pension is, but that's, if you did the same graph based on sustainability, it wouldn't be tremendously different. And you can see that there are a lot of these maybe middle income countries that are getting the lower grades on this scale, indicating that there may need to be reforms in the future to address sustainability. So that might suggest, oh, well, and a lot of these countries also have earnings-based defined benefit. So they might, type pensions, they might have some of the same kind of reforms that we've seen in other countries that I've argued have pushed people to work longer. On the other hand, and sorry, this is by region, I don't have this data by income group, but you can kind of make some inferences just by looking at it. The average coverage rates, the share of the workforce that is participating in these pensions is just much lower in these other countries. So that might be because, for example, the pension only covers people who work in the government, or it only covers workers in the formal sector. So even if there are pension reforms and they may affect the retirement decisions of those groups who are covered by the pension, we wouldn't expect as big of an effect on aggregate labor force participation just because fewer people are being covered by the pension. So this is just kind of where I want to leave us, and is to think about, what does it mean that we are living longer but not working longer in lower and lower middle income countries. So I think that if you go back to that diagram, those 4 extra years, they really seem like they're being translated into 4 years of retirement, not 4 extra years of work, or not being split between work and retirement. So what does that mean in terms of how are people financing this extra years of old age consumption? So here's just a list of the options, right? How you might be financing that. You could finance it yourself through greater labor earnings. Now, we've already seen that people don't seem to be working more at the end of their lives, but they could increase their labor force participation throughout their lives, right? Spread it out. So that's one possibility, and do more savings for their own retirement. There's also the possibility of relying more on family, either through direct financial transfers or being part of multi-generational households. One of the things that's interesting to note in the US and probably other developed countries, as these pensions spread in the 20th century, one of the things that happened was that was associated with the growth of older people living on their own. So anyway, so a source of support could be to continue to stay in multi-generational households. Employers obviously could play a role with providing pensions, and the government, of course, could provide support either through formal public pension programs or just through safety net programs that are also available to the elderly. So which of these sources looks promising in terms of financing those extra retirement years? These are just questions. I don't have the answers. The family is obviously a possibility. To the extent that fertility rates are declining, there's not as many children necessarily to rely on, but rising real wages may mean that those smaller number of children, adult children, are in a better, stronger position to provide support. The role of the employer, I think, is likely to only be really important where there's a strong formal sector and maybe a tradition of employers providing these benefits. There's some very specific, like, historical and tax reasons why, for example, US employers are so involved in providing benefits like health insurance or pensions that are not a big deal in other countries. So that's maybe seems less important. And obviously the government can play a big role here. The share of GDP that is spent on pensions, if you just look across regions, is less than 3% in all regions except for the higher income sort of Europe, OECD regions. So there potentially is room for governments to expand their support of the elderly through pensions. But of course, there's many competing priorities for government spending, and this may or may not be something that society wants to do. So I think at that point, I will just say thank you, stop sharing the screen, and I hope that sets the stage for some of the issues that may come up in some of the sessions to follow.
Okay, thank you very much, Courtney. That's very clear. Okay, I think this is actually, okay, first of all, I'd like to thank our staff members, of course, our keynote speaker, Courtney, and our president, Richard Buistek, for giving us some nice presentation. There was some technical difficulty, but it's available. I mean, the translation of our Hawaiian only is also available on our agenda website. So if you are interested, please take a look. Okay, so I think that's it. So Andrew Mason, he doesn't need any introduction, so he will moderate the next session. Andy?
Okay.
Thank you very much, Courtney. That was a wonderful presentation. And thank you, Sung-Yup, for your introduction and for kicking us off to a great start. So I want to mention the guidelines for the panel. So we have 10 minutes for each presentation. And I have my phone right here, and the alarm is going to go off at 10 minutes to remind you that your time is up. After the presentations, we will have our discussants will join us, and then we'll have questions and comments from the audience. And, wave your hand or use the chat, or turn off the mute and speak up if you have something you want to say. So let's try to reserve chatting for Q&A and for technical problems that you may encounter. So let me start by introducing our speakers and panelists. So we begin with Sung-Yup Lee and Chulkung Park, who are both at the University of Hawaii. Then we have Tanya Estenek and Jose Sampt, who are at the University of Ljubljana. Gretchen Dunhauer, University of California, Berkeley, and Colin Hayashida, who is at the University of Hawaii. And our discussants will be our very own now, Courtney Coyle, and Ronald Lee. So with that, let me turn over the mic back to Sung-Yup Lee.
Okay, so, okay, now I have the mic. So I think you can see my presentation. So the title is Health Capacity to Work at Older Ages, Evidence from South Korea and China. So this is co-authored with Chulkung Park. So Chulkung actually estimates everything. So if you have questions about that, technical questions, please ask him. So the questions and motivations. The question is very relevant. It's very very closely related to what Courtney said, and how much more can older people work given their health status. And we call it health capacity to work. An additional question is how does that contribute to the economy? So, Machikura, Hirogawa, and myself actually wrote a paper, and we named it Silver Dividend. Some people may not like this idea, but anyway. And the motivation is there is a growing literature for Western countries. Courtney showed that 12 countries, which is all European countries plus Canada, US, and Japan. But there is very limited evidence for Asia and other developing countries. And so why labor force participation with the elderly is not rising in some countries, especially low-income countries. So I hope that we can provide some evidence on this question that Courtney raised. So the paper is straightforward, actually. We extend Coyle, Milligan, and Wise, the International Social Security Project, and to South Korea and China using the CLOSA, which is South Korea's health and retirement studies, and the CHARS, which is for China. And we focus on males, and then after we actually estimate this, and we use NTA to measure the health capacity at the national level, we call it economic support ratio, and compare the result with the US. And we estimate the health capacity for subgroups. Actually, this is an interesting part too, but in China and Korea, only a very small number of people actually in Korea, even in Korea, only 1/3 of them receive pensions these days. So we actually compare the pension eligible versus ineligible groups. And also China has a very huge disparity. So we compare rural versus rural with urban. So see what happens. And Korea and China are very interesting cases as they experienced very rapid population aging in large part due to low fertility. And Korea's TFR is last year was 0.98 and 2008, and then last year is estimated like a 0.92. and cost of children is very high in both countries, and labor force participation of older people are very high, and a very high relative poverty rate for young and especially elderly, and familial transport for elderly is deteriorating. And public transports are rising, but still very low compared with other countries. So this graph shows how long it took from moving from like aging to aged and from aged to super aged society. According to UN, the definition is that if the percentage of elderly 65 and older accounts for 7% of the population, that's the aging society, and 14% is aged society, and 20% is a super aged society. So if you look at like France, wow, it took like 114 years to move from aging to aged society. And it take 38 years, it take 45 years from moving from aged to super aged society. And other European countries are similar. But if you look at like Korea, China, and some other actually Asian countries like Japan and Vietnam, it's a new record. It took only 18 years for Korea from moving from aging to aged society, and it takes only 8 years from moving from aged to super aged society. And China is similar. That's actually faster than Japan. It's, I mean, probably you'll be surprised that, wow, it's that fast. And Vietnam too. So you might think that, oh, actually, how about India and other countries? India is not here, but when I calculated using the world population perspectives, it's next to Vietnam. So it's so fast in many countries. So many countries, especially developing Asia and developing countries, they are getting old before they get rich. And the labor force participation of people 65 and older for OECD and other countries is listed here, and Korea is the second, followed by Iceland. Iceland is number one, and Korea has very, very high labor force participation of the elderly, and China is here in yellow bar, which is also very high. Another thing is the poverty rate of older population versus the elderly population. The horizontal line axis is poverty rate, relative poverty rate of the total population, and the vertical line is the relative poverty rate of population 65 and older. So relative means if they are, the percentage of people whose income is below the median. I mean, there are many definitions, but that's the usual definition. So if you look at it, China has the, of course, these are the OECD countries, so China is an exception, but we added China here. So China has very high poverty ratio for both old people and the population 60 and 5 older. But if you look at Korea, it's a really exception. Korea has the highest poverty rate for older population. So that means there are a lot of disparity. So, and pension disparity, South Korea. The future gross replacement rate for full career workers is 37%. So full career means we calculate this one assuming that people work, everybody actually, for more than 40 years. But in reality, it's much lower because they usually retire. I mean, they stop working from their career job at much younger ages. China also has a huge disparity in terms of coverage and amount between urban and rural area. So this is actually one issue in the data. In HRS, the Health and Retirement Studies have, in China and Korea, has a pension, but they have actually we actually distinguish low pensioner from high pensioner because in data, the low pension in Korea and China means actually they receive basic livelihood. This is so low. So it's a really poor people actually. If we receive a low pension in Korea, that means they are really, really poor people. So that's the government to just give us some money, for basic living. So it may indicate the poorest people. So we actually estimate the health capacity and then project it for low pensioners and high pensioners. So the methodology just mimic the Cutler, Miera, and Charles Shubik, or Coyle, Milligan, and Wise. So we estimate the relationship between health and the propensity of work for, say, aged 57 and 61. Then we project it for slightly older ages, so from 62 to, say, 70. So we simulate the baseline result to slightly older group and predict the work capacity of older people. Of course, there is a assumption. Assumption is that the relationship between health and propensity of a worker is same for these two groups. So the health capacity is the difference between actual and predicted employment. So that means it answers how much they could work given their health, but they don't, right? So that's the health capacity. And then after we estimate, we use anti-age profiles to convert it to national level at each age. So data is, like I said, is CLOSA for Korea, Korean longitudinal study of aging of 6 waves, 2006 to 2016. And we use the China Health and Retirement longitudinal survey study, CHARS. Actually, we also use the US data to compare the original health and retirement studies. And we use NTA data on labor income profiles on Korea, China, and also US and Japan to compare. And we use labor force participation rate to get the labor force participation rate current by age. This is actually used for decomposition. We use the IRO data, and of course we use the population data from UN. So the result shows that, I mean, I don't show any coefficients, but health gradients, health variables are very critical determinant for employment, labor force participation. So the blue line shows the actual labor force participation rate of South Korea. And the red line is the difference between actual and predicted. So that's the health capacity. So probably it's more meaningfully if you look at it from like age 60 to 70, then it's, so actually the baseline estimate is up to the 59, age 59, that it increases very rapidly. So that means actually there is a health capacity, I mean, about 20% at age 66, about, sorry, okay. At age 66, about 20% of people, more people can actually work. Okay, let me actually go faster. So, so we actually converted to the NTA measure. So this is using the estimate the labor force participation, and this is our new labor income profile. So this is P-axis, the wages of workers. So this is a new NTA profile. So the result is that the labor income estimated by economic support ratio increases by 1.3% for Korea and 1.1% for China, and which is much smaller than US or Japan. So it's working longer. I mean, if given their health status, may have a much smaller effect in these countries to support the elderly compared with other advanced economies. So I have a few more slides. So we actually did it by very heterogeneous groups, by education, by like even asset, the amount of assets. So we use estimated this one by pension status. That means in Korea, not everybody is eligible, right? So those who can actually receive a pension, which is a high pension, which is a green line, and no pension versus low pension. Actually, for low pensioners. So like I said, these are really the poorest people. There is not much health capacity. And there is a huge health capacity by high pension. The puzzling result is no pension, right? So those who don't have any pension actually has a very high health capacity. That means they retire actually probably early, which is very similar to urban China. The results are very similar. And in rural China, it's all similar. I mean, all same because not many people actually receive pensions anyway. So the natural question is, why do we have this kind of results? And we think that because there is other support system like assets or savings. So actually we look at how much their asset, like these people who don't have pensions, actually they are supported by other support system. So that's one of the very interesting results. So let me skip this one. Also, this is by education level. So the conclusion is that Korea and China have a much smaller untapped health capacity to work than other countries, and poor people, especially those who receive very low basic pension, are already working to their health limit, and there is no room for health capacity to work. And actually, the poor urban Chinese are even worse than rural Chinese. And health capacity to work can vary depending on many sources: pension benefits and productivity, savings, and other support systems for elderly. Okay, policy implications. And sorry, actually, just let me spend 30 more seconds. So this is actually related with their labor market characteristics, Korea and China. Productivity of elderly is low and very less sensitive to pension benefit because pension is not that very generous. And the labor market is there is a seniority-based wage system, and then in Korea especially, there is no voluntary retirement. This is the exact reason why Korea didn't use this raising pension eligibility age as a policy. Why? Because most people leave the labor market at age like 50, 51. So if the government raised the pension eligibility age, then their period until retirement actually is getting even longer. So Korea actually, and Japan as well, actually took a quite different approach, which means actually, okay, I'll talk about that later, but instead of raising retirement age, but that doesn't work. Actually, they forced the company, especially big companies, to keep the workers. So companies, especially big companies, cannot actually fire people until a certain age. So it's implemented last year, 2 years ago, sorry. Okay, that concludes my presentation, and let me stop sharing. Sorry about my overtime.
Sang-Yup, thank you very much. Now, Tanya Stanek and Yoje Sant will present their paper on increased women's labor market participation.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this session. It's very nice for all of you, meeting all of you. So I'm today going to talk about the population aging in European countries, basically, and also the consequences of population aging and the possibilities how to mitigate with this pressure on public sector sustainability. Okay, and it's paper written together with Yoje Sant. So European countries differ substantially in their cultural and institutional settings, and that's why the degree of economic dependency differs among these countries, as well as the channels through which this dependency is financed. However, in all of the European countries are facing rapid population aging, which will potentially put a pressure on public sustainability, or the sustainability of the public transfer system. So today I'm going to talk about how much or how big this pressure is in different EU countries, as well as how the negative consequences of population aging can be mitigated. So in economic as well as in demographic analysis, it is usually assumed that individuals are economically independent between ages 20 to 64. However, if we use the NTA results, we can see that this age span actually lasts only between ages 27 and 57 if we define the levels of independency as all these ages at which we are in surplus, meaning that our labor income is higher than our consumption. And this age span is shorter than what is usually assumed in basically or in all the EU countries. This period accounts for only 23 years in Greece and up to 37 years in Sweden. What NTA also adds to this analysis is the level of the deficit of the young and the elderly. And the height of this bar chart shows us the level of the deficit compared to the total labor income in different EU countries. And what we can see is that in countries where people retire pretty late, the deficit accounts for around 20% of a total labor income. These are countries such as Denmark and Cyprus. But this deficit can account to up to almost 40% in countries where people retire earlier, such as Romania and Greece. Because in future, the share of working age population is going to decrease, whereas the share of the elderly is going to increase, we decided to also project this indicator till 2050 by assuming that everything will stay the same. The only thing that will change is population age structure. And what we got is the following. So if nothing would be changed, just the population age structure, the deficit in Romania and Greece will account for more than 70% of total labor income. So here I'm talking about just the deficit of the elderly people. And of course, this is a huge number, especially because of the fact that working age population has to also finance their own consumption as well as the consumption of their children. On the other hand, there are countries with pretty favorable population projections as well as low levels of indicators. These are countries such as Sweden and Denmark, and there is also a country which will face a huge increase in the deficit because of the population aging, and these are countries such as Germany, Poland, and Spain. However, we should bear in mind that not all of the deficit is covered by public transfers in the form of pay-as-you-go pensions, for example, but there is a substantial part, colored in green, okay, which is covered by private reallocations. These private reallocations are mainly capital accumulated by individuals in the past. And of course, in those countries where the deficit is to a large extent covered by private reallocations, such countries will not be that so pressured by the population aging. These are countries such as UK, Germany, and Luxembourg, for example, but in majority of EU countries, still public reallocations prevail. This is especially true for countries such as, for example, Greece, and then Austria, Finland, Estonia, etc. So it seems something has to be changed in our system. So what we can do? First, possibility is to reduce the economic dependency of the elderly population. We can do that by decreasing public benefits or by lowering, for example, the consumption of the elderly. However, both these two measures will, of course, lower the quality of life for the elderly. On the other hand, by regarding the fact that the life expectancy at birth is prolonging quickly over time, we can increase the labor force participation of the elderly, and this somehow sounds as a reasonable measure. On the other hand, we can also increase the ability of the working age population to support the others. This can be done, for example, by increasing fertility rate. However, this is something that is hard to achieve, and it will also have an effect only on the long run. On the other hand, we can also increase the surplus, and this is something I'm going to talk about later on. Luckily, in the meantime, European countries have implemented several pension reforms, and they will basically mainly influence the participation rates of persons aged 55 to 64. What we can see here that if all these pension reforms will be indeed implemented, the participation rates for both men and women will drastically increase till 2070. But what we can also see is that participation rates for women will stay much lower in majority of countries than those of men. If all these measures will be indeed implemented, or these pension reforms will be indeed implemented, the age-related expenditures will be, of course, lower than what is expected without these pension reforms. However, we can see that in majority of countries, the age-related expenditures are going to increase even though all these pension reforms are going to be implemented. So something else should be done as well. And one possibility is to increase labor force participation rate of women. What one of our past NTA research shows is that the total surplus of the working age population is higher in those countries where the contribution of women is high. These are countries such as Slovenia, Denmark, Sweden, Hungary, etc. Also, if we look just market values of consumption and labor income in EU countries, we can see that even though so both genders consume pretty much the same amount, we can see that men produce much more than what women do, okay? But this is only one part of the economy. If we include the unpaid household work, so the monetized values of unpaid household work, we can see that the gender differences become smaller. But there are also some interesting cases, like for example, Spain, where by including unpaid household work, the gender differences become negligible. In the next table, I'm showing you the results for 14 EU countries for which harmonized NTA and NTA data are available. This left part is market economy only, and this right part is a total economy, so market and non-market one. And what we can see here is that if we include only market economy, in countries such as Italy and UK, the contribution of women in a way of, or in a sense of surplus only, accounts for around up to 3% of what the men contribute to the economy, whereas there are countries such as Slovenia where this contribution of women accounts for 62% of what is contribution of men. If we add the unpaid household work, we can see that the gender differences are going to be smaller in all the countries. However, there are countries such as Italy and Spain where gender differences become really negligible, but there are also countries like Lithuania and Slovenia, for example, where the contribution of women becomes even higher than those of men if we include unpaid household work. But there are still countries like Germany and the UK in which the contribution of women is still lower, much lower than the one of men, even though we include unpaid household work. And in these countries, we claim that the measure of increasing participation rate for women is indeed a relevant one. So to conclude, I would say that increased women's labor market participation is possibly an effective measure only in countries in which the contribution of women compared to men remains low even after including unpaid household work. These are countries such as Germany, the UK, Estonia, and Poland. But it's quite problematic measure in countries such as Lithuania and Slovenia, and also Finland, Italy, and Spain, where workload of women is already high. In such countries, a higher woman participation in the labor market would probably lead to less time spent on unpaid household labor, or it would mean a squeeze out their women's leisure time. Because traditional patterns of division of labor between men and women are hard to change in a short run, this will probably mean a decrease in welfare in such countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanya. That was a terrific presentation and very interesting.
Thank you.
So now I would like to turn the speaker over to Gretchen Dunhauer, who's going to talk about unpaid care work.
Thank you, Andy. I would like to now ask Mari to launch my pre-recorded presentation because my internet's lousy and there's a lot of construction going on at my house. So Mari, if you could go ahead and cue that up. Thank you. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'll be speaking about the care economy in an uncertain future. This work comes out of the Counting Women's Work project in NTA, which is about bringing the gender perspective to national transfer accounts, and then also incorporating unpaid care work into our estimates, which is left out of traditional economic accounting measures. The objectives of this research are to give policymakers quantified data on the current care economy that's consistent over time and comparable across places. It includes both paid and unpaid care work, which are often considered separately to one another, whereas this research incorporates both parts of the care economy, and that estimates that can be used with available population projections. And we combine current estimates with change scenarios to envision impacts on the future care economy. So the roots of the methodology are going to be familiar to many of you. We have the National Transfer Accounts methodology that includes market-based measures by age and sex, and so I pull out those pieces that relate to the care economy: child care workers, home health aides, adult daycare workers, and household service providers. Now, this certainly could include a whole bunch of other workers, like teachers, like doctors. For now, I was keeping the definition more closely substitutable with unpaid care workers, but in future iterations of the research that might change. For the national time transfer accounts, we have consumption and production of unpaid care work by age and sex, and that includes direct care for children, elders, sick and disabled persons, and indirect care through housework and household management. To jump right into the results, what is shown here is a snapshot, so cross-sectional, unpaid care work production age profiles. So again, that's unpaid care work combines both direct care activities and then indirect care activities provided through housework. And the data are pooled 3-year samples from the American Time Use Survey. The red lines are for women, the blue lines are for men, and there are sort of 3 lines for each set that showed 3 different time periods, although none of the years is particularly different from any of the other years, so the time aspect isn't as vital here. This is the same information but broken out by indirect versus direct care. So direct care is peaking in those child rearing ages, whereas indirect care seems to be increasing with age group over time for both women and men until you get to the oldest age groups. Moving now to unpaid care work consumption, what we see here is consumption imputed to individuals based on the amount of unpaid care work that was produced in their households and also their household structure, and then assumptions about how care is consumed. So the imputation method differs by type of care. Direct versus indirect care are done differently. Direct care is based, the imputation is based on household structure by age and sex. And then for indirect care, we assume that all household members share in that equally. And then there are other procedures to apportion care that is transferred to non-household members to the proper age and sex. So what we see is that infants and young children are the biggest consumers of unpaid care work, and but older persons also consume quite a bit of this type of care. This slide breaks that out into indirect versus direct care. So young children are consuming the most direct care, and then older persons are the biggest consumers of indirect care. So moving now to the paid care work side, we see age profiles of paid care work production. So red for women, blue for men. Those same time periods are shown, but there's not much change across those different time slices. The data come from the current population survey and are age profiles of the time reported working in paid care work occupations, as discussed previously. So one thing to notice here, again, women do a lot more of this work than men. The red lines are much higher, but also the magnitude, the size of the total amount of work produced is much lower than unpaid care work. So up at the top there for women, that peak hours per day is 0.3, so that's about 12 minutes compared to unpaid care work, which was for some levels, age groups 4 and 5 hours per day. So in this slide shows the paid care work production broken out by direct versus indirect. So the largest amount being produced is women in red. They're producing direct care, In green is women producing indirect care, and then men's production in this sector is down in the bottom, the blue and black. So this is in contrast to the unpaid care work sector, where there was much more indirect than direct. Most of the paid care work production is being produced in direct care activities. What's shown in this slide is paid care work consumption. And we get these estimates by imputing based on consumer expenditure survey spending on those personal services. And our imputation method differs by the type of care. But we have the amount people spent on these types of services with the overall hours produced from the current population survey. So we get an average wage and can thus figure out sort of an average amount of time of these services consumed in each household. And the biggest consumers are young children, although we see at the older age groups that the paid care work is also increasing at the oldest ages. Breaking that paid care work out into direct and indirect care components shows that most of what the kids are consuming is direct care, and that there's not much going on in the indirect care for paid care work. So thinking about the future of the care economy, we can imagine it in the context of population aging. So these are pictures from the United States on the left panel, an age distribution for 2015 versus 2030. And on the right, a sex ratio changes from 2015 in blue to 2030. So what we see is familiar to most of you, that we will have more older people in 2030, fewer young people, and also that sex ratio is going to go down a bit. So how is our care economy going to be impacted by these changes? We can create care support ratios, which are like regular support ratios, excuse me, but instead of NTA age profiles weighted by population projection, they're care production and consumption age profiles by population projection. We take the ratios of aggregate care production versus consumption and do our thought experiment. If individuals stay the same but the population changes, what's going to happen? So what's charted here are our care support ratios in different sectors for 2030 relative to baseline year of 2015. So at the baseline, these care support ratios are all going to be 1, because the care consumed has to equal the care produced. However, over time, our age structures will either favor the production of each type of work or the consumption. So in 2030, all of these different kinds of care support ratios for unpaid care work, paid care work are above 1. So that gives no evidence of supply shortfall. In fact, it looks very much like it will be easier to provide the care needed by our society in 2030 than it is today, although this is all from estimates pre-COVID, so who knows. And what's going on here is that time-expensive kids are being replaced by time-generative older persons in the age structure. This picture would change if we looked at a longer time period and say if we drilled down to different types of care. So those care support ratios showed a pretty rosy picture. What could go wrong with that? So in my household, certainly the biggest worry we have is, what if schools never reopen? I mean, they'll open eventually, but certainly schools staying closed increases the peak childcare burden. And in one analysis for the US that I did, it was over an hour a day averaged across all adults. So we could also see a quantity-quality trade-off with lower fertility in the US. Maybe our time burden for children won't decrease. We'll just spend more time on the existing fewer number of children. Increasing dementia prevalence. Certainly we're going to have more people in the age groups where dementia is the most prevalent. That could erode care support ratios because dementia is a very care-intensive disease. But this is very sensitive to the change scenario. So the idea that for any specific age group, dementia prevalence might go up is highly disputed. And then finally, we could have a change in immigration policy that impacts the supply of paid care workers. paid care work is heavily immigrant labor, and so if we continue to restrict immigration, or if the United States becomes a less desirable place to immigrate to, that could impact the supply of paid care work providers. So using our estimates, we're trying to develop ways to gauge these risks specifically and put direction and magnitude onto them, which would hopefully make them more useful for policy. Thank you very much. I look forward to talking more with all of you about these issues.
What I was trying to do in that research was Counting Women's Work has worked for a long time to estimate the unpaid care work part of the economy. And we want to now also add to that the paid care work part. So many of us have been working on NTA for many years, but we haven't picked out particular sectors. So if I can pick out the paid care work economy, I can do a little more to understand how the whole care economy might work. If unpaid care work is going to have certain stresses, maybe paid care work will pick up the slack, or vice versa. In the case of COVID, certainly very much waiting on the data to come out to show how with the very rapid decline of the paid care work sector, how the unpaid care work sector has had to respond. And so using care support ratios, we can tell how changes over time in certain aspects of the economy are going to make it harder or easier to provide the care that is demanded. So that's the much shorter answer.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. With that, let me turn over the presentation to Cullen.
Hello, everyone. I am Cullen Hayashida, and I'm here to start our next session on Japan's depopulation and workforce shortage crisis, 11 strategies, and a macro research agenda. What I wanted to do during this presentation is to provide you with an overview with regards to what is happening to Japan in terms of this major demographic change that is affecting Japan for the rest of this century. What I wanted to share with you was that Japan is going through a depopulation trend, but this is not particularly unique to Japan itself. This is something that has been recorded and monitored in various other countries in the world. There's 20 here listed. And there's several others, including Korea, Russia, that are also going through the same process as well. And there are factors associated with this, such as population aging, low birth rates, low immigration, high emigration, war, high death rates, high rates of abortion, and high infant mortality. So this is something that we are seeing occurring in Japan itself, but also in other parts of the world. So much of what we see today has international implication. So when we look at Japan, in terms of depopulation, we start with year 1400. And what we find is that the population at that time was about 10 million. It went up to about 44 million by the year 1900. And it peaked at around 126, 127 million around 2000, 2005. Since then, there's been a precipitous decline that seems to be continuing without much without any change whatsoever, despite what little attempt is being made right now by Japan to reverse this particular trend. If this were to continue, some have suggested that by the year 3033, by 3300, the year 3300, Japan will have no one around. So needless to say, this is of great concern. And the question is, what can be done to reverse this? Here are 11 strategies that I took a look at. And there's, in the 10-minute period, there's very little time to cover all of this very well, but we can make reference to them here quickly. The technology, increase in foreign workers, increase in birth rates, promotion of the active aging lifestyle, increase retirement age, decrease the emigration of young people, increase the emigration of old people, increase women in the workforce, de-urbanization, promotion of child support, and community development. During the question and answer period, perhaps we can elaborate on some of these things a little bit further. The first strategy that we'd like to talk about is technology. With shrinking workforce, there's a need to increase the efficiency of each worker. So if there was 50 million workers and population of workers were to drop down to 40 million, the question is whether or not technology could be provided to increase the productivity, the efficiency of the workers to offset that loss of 10 million workers. Now, there's numerous things that are being done right now to encourage the use of technology with what we call robotics, with artificial intelligence, the analysis of big data, the use of internet and high-speed internet connectivity, and so on. The question is whether or not any of these will have the effect that's necessary to make up the difference. So the second strategy that we can make reference to is the importation of more foreign workers. There's about 2 million foreigners that are working in Japan right now, and recently there's some agreements with countries like Vietnam and Indonesia to bring in foreign workers for periods up to 5 years for skilled and unskilled work in a whole variety of fields. There's enormous costs involved, and there's also some expense involved when people or these workers, foreign workers, are allowed to stay for 5 years, learn the language, and then sent back to Japan, back to their home countries. So the question is whether or not there's a sufficient supply of foreign workers. There's two things working against this. One having to do with the increased international competition of foreign workers now and into the future, and the fact that Japan is being somewhat restrained in terms of the number of people that they are actually allowed to come in. And given the speed at which the workforce shortage is occurring, question is that reluctance, is that going to, in a sense, impede the ability of Japan to maintain fiscal financial viability under those circumstances? The third strategy is increased birth rate. 2.1 birth per childbearing aged woman is what is necessary to maintain a stable population. Japan's fertility rate, however, is at 1.4. So with that drop in fertility rate, population drops. There's a whole variety of things that are being done to encourage young people and married couples to have more children, with social marketing to encourage more marriages, financial incentives, cash payments for having children, family incentives with paternity leaves and maternity leaves and child care support services and policy changes with employment and so on. But if any of or all of these initiatives were to work, it will still take another 20 years before a child born next year would actually become a tax-paying member of society. So this is a long-term strategy. The last has to do with active aging, and this targets those that are um, still young adults that are entering retirement. So these are pre-retirees or active retirees, people that have an enormous amount of skills and talents and networks and time on their hands and some resources as well. And the question is whether or not there's ways in which it is possible to keep them fiscally and financially fit. And in doing so, it might be possible for people to not only increase their life expectancy, but their health expectancy as well, and thereby reduce their pressures on the national coffers. So this is one of the things that Japan is certainly looking at in great detail. Other strategies that have been discussed and are under consideration are things like deurbanization, community development, the increased use of women in the workforce, increased emigration of older workers, that is allowing older people to leave the country, decreased emigration of young people, that is trying to look at and monitor the loss of young people from the society itself, increasing retirement age, improving child support, infrastructure, and possibly others as well. What I have here in this particular slide is a roadmap, a overview of these 11 strategies and considering the possibility of looking at their impact over time for the rest of the 21st century, and to ask ourselves whether or not some of these strategies might have more of an impact than others. What I have included here is hypothetical data, and I cannot emphasize this enough. This is hypothetical data. But if we were to visualize these strategies over time in this way collectively, perhaps this becomes a roadmap for research in order to validate or to document whether or not some of these impacts are as noted here. This is work for the future. So based upon that, what I foresee is a need for some recommendations, and I have 4 here. One calls for convening of national symposiums, or not just one, but perhaps a series of symposiums on strategies that have been identified and others that have yet to be identified, and collaborate with government and business and academia and nonprofits to see what more can we learn with regards to these strategies that have been identified. Another thing that needs to be done is to begin identifying these initiatives and newly emerging initiatives as well. Then we need to start the process of evaluating the effectiveness of these strategies and their interaction with other strategies to determine their implementation potentials and their challenges, and to possibly propose recommendations to facilitate their increased effectiveness. And finally, I think that there's a need to create a research and policy center that is a coordinating center to monitor, to evaluate, and possibly provide policy recommendations to facilitate the reversal of workforce shortage and these depopulation trend. Is it possible for this type of a center, this coordinating center, possibly government, possibly nonprofit, to recommend funding for promising strategies, combination of strategies, and their coordination over time? And hopefully we can talk and discuss this further during the question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cullen. That was very informative. Let's now move to our discussants, and let me ask Courtney to offer her observations at this point.
Well, those were 4 super talks, and I know we don't have a lot of time, and people may have questions that we want to get to. So I will just be really brief. I think with respect to Sang Hop's talk, one thing I'd be interested in getting a firmer sense of is you say that there isn't as much untapped health capacity in South Korea and China as perhaps estimated in some other countries. And my sense is that the reason that untapped health capacity emerges in some other countries is that actually health only declines pretty modestly at age, like the slope is not that steep. And so that is what goes into the prediction. Then we predict that a lot of people can work because health's only declining pretty slowly, but then actual work falls off a cliff, likely because you have all these generous pensions available and so on. So is your sense the reason why it is a little bit different? I mean, there is untapped health capacity, but not as much as some other countries. It could be because actually health is declining more rapidly. But it could also be because, if I just get my logic around, because work is not falling, is only declining very modestly with age. So is there a sort of quick answer as to which story it is? And I know we've got multiple countries and also sort of different groups, people with and without pensions and so on. So as much as you might want to say there.
So, Sang-Yup, do you want to respond to that now?
Okay. I mean, it's a quick question, actually. In terms of the regression, actually, the health capacity is not smaller. I mean, in Korea and China, it's not smaller, actually. But in terms of NTA, that means actually it's just labor force participation. It's not labor income. What you estimate, that's the health capacity, right? So when we convert it to the national income, we have to multiply their productivity. So it's not clear from the presentation. So we actually use this converted health capacity, which is employment rate, and multiply by age-specific productivity using NTA. And then actually it's much lower than US or Japan because in large part because the wage of workers are very low in Korea and China. So this has been by, we have done this one for many countries. So the bottom line is that if the countries are already working, like Korea and China, labor force participation is really extremely high. But they are working in very low wage sector. So even though you have a health capacity, if you convert it to actual labor income, it's very low. That's it. It's not actually about the estimation. It's about the national level estimation. It's not the micro estimation. Okay. So it's the productivity reason.
Great. And again, knowing time is short, maybe I won't make anything else a question, but just try to see if I can do one comment that kind of is an umbrella over everybody's. I was very interested in Tanya's presentation and her conclusions that when you incorporated women's unpaid contributions, there were some places where there actually wasn't much space for them to increase labor force participation, at least not without experiencing a sharp decrease in welfare, because that would either greatly increase their workload or displace that other kind of work they were doing. So I think it'd be interesting to think about in countries where women's labor force participation has increased, what has actually happened there, and if it doesn't shift in the short run, maybe does it shift in the long run. In terms of Gretchen's, there were just a lot of great unanswered questions at the end about, for instance, how rising rates of Alzheimer's disease, and tying it into the final presentation as well, questions about emerging technologies that might help with taking care of older people, and also whether we can live healthier as we age makes an enormous difference in terms of the amount of healthcare resources that are going to need to go, and how much paid and unpaid care work is going to be needed at older ages. So it just kind of applaud everybody for taking these issues up more seriously in all of these papers. Let me turn it over to Ron in case he has any comments.
Thank you, Courtney. Ron, it's on to you.
Let's see. Okay, I hope you can hear me now. I have a PowerPoint, but I'm going to leave it to the side and just talk. I think that will be better. So why don't I start with this interesting question that Courtney raised and Sonia responded to, because that's one point where I had a thought in response to Sonia's presentation and paper. And that is that when I look at, say, labor income by age in China, and this is also true in Korea, but to a lesser extent, it's just striking how fast and how early labor income declines in China. So by age 50, labor income is down to, I think, half of its peak level. And by age 60, it's down to about 15% of its peak level. It's just extraordinary, and extraordinary in the context of NDA countries, where that's just not what we generally see. So we see that in China, as I say, much less so in Korea, but I think we'd also see it in Vietnam, probably. So I had thought, oh, older people are just, withdrawn from the labor force early for one reason or another, and have to raise the labor force participation rate and so on. China postponed retirement. But after reading this paper and hearing this talk, I realized, I've just been wrong. That was a mistaken interpretation of the data. So what is going on? Well, then what I think is, I think we're mostly seeing the effects of extremely rapid economic growth and extremely rapid increase in educational attainment of younger people. So that in these East Asian countries, and I suppose the same would be true in India now, but in these East Asian countries, children may be earning 5, 6, 7 times what their parents were earning at the same age. That's the consequence of productivity growth at 5, 6, 7, 8% per year over sustained numbers of years over the decades. And so the labor productivity of older people looks extremely low relative to their children's productivity when we look at it in cross-section or if we look at it longitudinally. And I think that's what we're seeing in China and South Korea. Productivity is so low for the elderly, not because they're not working hard, but because it's so high for their children because of the rapid economic growth. My own sense is that nonetheless, it makes sense to keep in place that tradition and any policies supporting high labor force participation of the elderly, because this economic growth is going to slow down, and then these countries are going to be faced with all the problems of the Western world, and they can get a head start on this by maintaining labor force participation of older people. Okay, so that's a thought about Sonia's paper. Like Courtney, I thought these were 4 terrific papers, and there were a number of surprises in them, and that one I just mentioned now for Sonia's paper is one of them. For Cullen's paper on Japan, a very nice broad view of policies and so on. Let me raise 1 or 2 questions. One is we've started out seeing depopulation. Is depopulation bad? Is fertility below replacement bad? Well, there may be cultural, political reasons and so on. One might regret it, but from a narrow perspective of trying to maximize per capita, individual economic well-being, it's not clear that it's bad. And I point to our group NTA paper in Science in 2014, where we addressed this question for many countries, including Japan, and concluded that fertility somewhat below replacement was, goes with the highest level of consumption, at least over the long run. Okay. Gretchen's talk I found very interesting, and one of the most surprising things to me was the projected support ratios, the care time support ratios that show a great, I had thought they would show a tightening of the time budget constraint as they do for normal NTA support ratios, but of course they don't. They show the opposite, and I think we know why. It's because, as Gretchen said, the elderly demand a lot of care time, they need a lot of care time, but they mostly supply it themselves. They're taking care of one another, taking care of themselves. And so the net care time demand of the elderly is very little. The real net demand for care time is by children, and we've had declining fertility in the US, and somewhat surprisingly over the last 10 years. And so you project that forward to 2030, there will be a lot fewer kids to take care of. It's a surprising similarity between the effects of population aging in the US and what happens to the measurement of the demographic dividend once you include time costs of children, or the whole NTA, time transfers across the life cycle. Once you include those, and the demographic dividend looks much bigger and more prolonged, and now we see it's so prolonged that it's continuing even in population aging phase when fertility declines. So all that's very interesting. And then last, and I'm running over a hair here, but Tanya and Yoja, very interesting work and more fruits of the NTTA or related time transfer work. In this case, I guess the European Union countries mostly. The one, and they're calling attention to the same point that I think is implicit in Gretchen's talk. You raise female labor force participation, and women go to work in the market, there be a cost, and the cost has to be borne, and it might be borne by men working less in the market and more in the home. It might be borne by women having less leisure. It might just be borne by a reduction in home production, and we might say the quality and level of consumption in the home. And my guess is it's some combination of those three factors. The one question I had was the extent to which the results for those countries that seem to have some surplus, some slack, such that women could go to work without it having a big impact. I guess the UK, maybe Germany, I don't remember quite which countries those were. But to what extent is that because the time budgets of women in those countries look different? And to what extent is it because the replacement wage wages that are used to convert the hours of work in the home into market equivalents are radically different, radically lower in the UK and Germany for some reason, possibly related to the presence of immigrant labor or I don't know what. And to the extent that it is because women's wages are just very low relative to men's, or at least they are for the replacement tasks for household work, then it's not so clear what the policy implications are. That it's not at all clear that in that case, having women leave the home and go into the market would be more useful in a narrow economic sense. And it might be interesting, instead, I'm sure you've done all this and thought about all this, but I'll say it anyway. But so it might be useful to look at the leisure time as a kind of metric for assessing how intensely women's work and women's time and men's time is being devoted to production. Okay, anyway, great papers. I enjoyed them very much. They were full of surprises for me. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ron. Let me, we're over, but I don't think that's a huge problem. So let me open it up to everyone who's joined us to ask questions, make observations, and then I'll give the presenters a moment at the end to respond. So you can either chat or wave your hand or whatever, and I'll try to check that out. Or unmute yourself and just talk.
Is it okay? This is Gretchen. Can I actually ask Courtney a question, going back to her presentation before the break?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you. It was really compelling, the story you showed about why it looks like it's pension reform so much that it sort of contributed to the end of the decline and the beginning of the increase of labor force participation at older ages. And so doesn't that really make the inequality story so much more relevant? Because if a lot of the pension reforms also mean people are working longer or people are getting fewer benefits, so you're sort of rebalancing the system more on the backs of people who are going to have shorter life expectancies, who are going to be lower socioeconomic status. So, I mean, that seems to make the issue of inequality in wages in lifespans so much more important for how we structure these pension reforms.
I couldn't agree more. I don't have answers per se, except to say that I think that that's like an area that's been really neglected and overlooked, because I think people have looked at kind of these averages and said, okay, we're living longer and our systems are facing long-term financial problems. And so these kinds of reforms make sense. And they do, but then you need to think about, particularly with respect to the reforms that are explicitly designed to encourage people to work longer, you need to think about whether everybody's able to work longer. And health is a big part of that. Labor demand can be an issue. And then, as you point out, there can also just be like an equity issue, because actually we're not all working longer. In the US, and Ron and I worked on a report on this together, and other people have found this as well, like the gains in life expectancy have really accrued to people at the top half of the income distribution, and not at the bottom half. But again, it gets sort of obscured when you just look at the average and you say on average we're living longer, so of course we should work longer. I think there is space to think about what that means, what kind of policies make sense in a world where you have increasing inequality and longevity. But I'm not sure what the right policies are, because it quickly gets complicated. I mean, I think you want to, if it's that people can't work longer because of health, for example, then you say, well, that's what disability insurance is for, right? But we know that disability insurance doesn't do a perfect job of targeting those people who can't work longer, and that in some of, I didn't show this specifically, but like in some of the international social security countries, there have been times in the past where like a third or 40% of workers retired through the DI route. Like, was that really because those people all couldn't work, or was it because, you know, there was sort of a policy decision made to make it like that an easier route? So just sort of getting that right, is difficult. And similarly, thinking about, you know, do you want to have early retirement ages, or sorry, eligibility ages in your pension that depend on I don't know, the life expectancy for people in your lifetime income group. I mean, theoretically, you could do something like that. I don't know of any countries that have gone in that direction specifically. I will just finally say that this is exactly where the work of the International Social Security Project is going. We want to center inequality in our work rather than just kind of doing a general analysis and then having some table at the end that says, oh, and by education, here's some results, but really kind of put it more at the heart of the work. So.
Other questions, comments? Please don't hesitate.
Okay, I can actually add to what Courtney said and Gretchen said. The important actually lesson from the, this ISS project is that it's for the advanced economies, and my paper on Korea and China shows that we're actually raising pension over age. I mean, people don't respond to it because there are many people who are not eligible for pension benefits. So the one thing we can reduce the pension, the disparities that, provide more social assistance for the poor people. That means it's not just, raising, the issue is not just keeping all people in the labor market. We have to provide the social assistance and social insurance to everybody, at the minimum level. So reducing the disparity of pension benefit by rural and urban, especially in developing economies, is very, very important. So we are talking about raising pension over age, it's like pension reform, right? But for many less developed countries, we are much at lower level, increasing the pension benefit. For everybody, the coverage and the level is also very important. And also, there are so many, self-employed or informal sectors in other countries. So we have to take care of that because it's very, very difficult for many countries to be covered by the pension pension because this in rural sector is very hard to enforce the system.
We have time for one more question or comment. Please just unmute yourself and speak up if you want to seize that opportunity. Going once, going twice, gone. Okay, let me now turn things over to our speakers for any final observations. Courtney, would you like to weigh in any way?
I don't know that I have a final concluding comment, but just thank you again for the invitation to be part of your meeting. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for joining us. Sang-Yup?
Oh, okay. So, many of the reasons why this happens in other countries, which is different from European countries, is that the labor market rigidity. So it's there is a seniority-based wage system in some Asian countries. So from the company's point of view, they actually want to force, make the older people to leave the labor market. So that's actually one thing. So we need to make the labor market more flexible. And I think that's it. That's my additional comment.
Okay, thank you. Tanya?
So I don't know, I have nothing to add, but just, yes, thank you for I would say for really, really nice keynote speech and also for all the other presentations. And that's it from my side.
Thank you. Gretchen?
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I guess as a parting note, I would just say that I hope everybody pays a lot of attention to the rest of the time transfer accounts sessions that we have throughout the week. I think that if the COVID pandemic has shown us anything, it is that the invisible unpaid care work, I should say invisible in big air quotes, economy really is the bedrock on which our market economy sits. And so at least silver lining of the pandemic is that it is bringing that much more into visibility for everyone. Thanks.
Colin?
Yeah, Andy, thank you again also for having me participate. I'm a sociologist. Gerontology is my specialty, and so being among economists, of course, has been a first time for me. So my presentation has been based upon my activities in Japan over the past 7 months, where I was doing some teaching there, and I had my students participate with me, given the fact that there were so many things going on, particularly with a variety of things that were coming out with regard to strategy. So this was an attempt to pull this all together in a sense. One comment with regards to perhaps, depopulation is not bad. That has come up well, in some of my discussions with some of the professors in Japan, with pollutions, with mass migration possibilities and other sorts of issues on resource depletions. It makes sense perhaps that, that populations should stabilize over time. But what we see in Japan, and, with Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, has suggested that perhaps the population at 126 million right now should not drop below 100 million. But the situation right now is that it's a free fall. There's no real understanding with regards to how to sort of readjust it and control this. And then there's some major issues with regards to the disproportionate burden on the working population on the dependent young and the dependent old that is continuing to grow over time with depopulation. So all of these issues are just sort of just exploding right now in Japan. And what I was trying to do was to kind of pull this together and see what in fact is happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. And Ron, let me thank you as well for your insights, which are always terrific. Let me mention, let's see, I want to mention again that these presentations are all available on the NTA website. These are open to the public. And so I hope you will share this widely with people who will be interested in this session and the ones that will follow. So speaking of follow, we're going to have another session that begins in a little less than 4 hours. I know that's not going to be too convenient for a lot of you, but we wanted to schedule this so it would be convenient for people in Hawaii. But this is part of a tradition of talking about the host place in our NTA meetings. And so we wanted to provide people with an opportunity to learn a bit more about Hawaii, except about what a beautiful, beautiful spot it is. And then let's see, 5 hours after that, we have another session on the generational economy that's going to be chaired by Professor Nayana. So I hope those of you who can will join in for that session as well. If you have any questions, please let us know. And I look forward to seeing you as the week progresses. So thank you very much.